Legislative coverage on SDPB is supported by the South Dakota Bar Foundation, SDN Communications, Missouri River Energy Services, Wrench Law, and your membership in the Friends of SDPB. Thank you.
This is a production of SDPB.
A shakeup on the Appropriations Committee in Pierre might mean new voices around the table. From SDPB, it's Wednesday, February 5th. This is In the Moment State House. Coming up this hour, political news and analysis from South Dakota's 100th legislative session. We will begin the hour with SDPB's Lee Strubinger. We'll hear the latest on the debate over property taxes. Then political scientists David Wiltsey and Lisa Hager are with us. We'll have analysis on President Donald Trump's efforts to reshape the federal government in his first 2 weeks of office. Plus, Gene Hunhoff and Linda Duba join us for a look at governing in Pierre in a time of political transition, including the role of public money in public schools. That's coming later in the hour. We're broadcasting today from SDPB's Kirby Family Studio in Sioux Falls. I'm Lori Walsh. You're in the moment. News is first.
What exactly is an executive order? It's a question we received from so many of you. Like others before him, Donald Trump has signed dozens. But why do presidents have this power in the first place? Our listener-led series looks at the history of executive orders, their role, and how well they work. That's next time on 1A.
Listen Wednesday morning at 10 Central, 9 Mountain on SDPB.
This evening on Jazz Nightly, we'll hear the latest by guitarist Dave Stryker. He has an album of film music with strings. Also, San Francisco trumpeter and composer Eric Jacobson mixes jazz with minimalism, and the Hot Toddies recreate the classic sounds of swing. I'm Carl Gerke, and you can join me at 8 Central, 7 Mountain, here on SDPB Radio.
I must have crossed this bridge a million times, but the first time I remember was when my brothers, the twins, Mars and Alex, were born. But Mars is gone now, and all I'm left with is his camera. Now that I'm back here, can I find my memories of us? Can I find you?
Independent Lens, Monday, 9/8 Mountain on SDPB TV.
Welcome to In the Moment State House. I'm Lori Walsh. We begin this hour with SDPB's politics and public policy reporter Lee Strubinger. He is joining us from SDPB's SDN Communications Studio and the Capitol Building in Pierre. Lee Strubinger, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Lori. Good to be here.
Now, it seems like it wasn't too long ago that we were talking about property taxes and different ways taxes might be collected, and now that topic has returned. Property taxes are top of mind in Pierre. Tell me a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah, so anybody who's gotten their assessor notice in the last couple years has noticed that their property taxes have gone up, and that's partly due to the fact that property values have gone up with, kind of the housing inventory being a little bit on the lower side, and then you also have folks moving to the state here and some demand for some of our more kind of urban centers or maybe out in the Black Hills. The demand for housing is there, and it had been driving costs up. And as a result, a lot of people who've been here for many years have seen that also go up, and they've let their state legislators know that they don't like that it's gone up as much as it has. And so from the governor's office to Republicans and Democrats in both the House and Senate, everybody in this building is really looking at wanting to address the issue of owner-occupied dwelling property taxes.
So we had some housing workforce development initiatives not too long ago. Are they part of this, or is that a separate conversation from this? Help me understand that.
Yeah, so a lot of that initiative was basically how to use that influx of federal COVID stimulus dollars towards infrastructure projects that would help spur housing development. I live in Rapid City, and we're seeing a lot of housing development go up. So I can't speak to much of the rest of the state because that's where I spend most of my time, but I imagine that's also happening in Sioux Falls and many other places. So that is starting to alleviate some of the market pressures, but a lot of those values for those homes are still there. I was looking at a Federal Reserve study that kind of showed the trend of housing prices and values, and it's really gone up. It went up steeply from like late 2020 to 2022, and it's still kind of been like inching up. And it kind of remains to be seen what will happen with those values going forward, whether they kind of flatline or continue to go up. Some people I've talked to seem to think that those values might flatline, and that this could be an instance where the kind of property taxes that owner-occupied folks are paying really just maybe it flatlines, and that's kind of like the new normal. That all kind of remains to be seen.
All right, so what are some of the proposals on the table? What arguments are you hearing in the halls of the State House?
Yeah, so before we get into some of the proposals, for folks that don't know, there are basically three types of property tax classifications. You have agriculture, you have owner-occupied dwellings, and then you have commercial. And over the last, I would say, 10 years, we've seen a large increase in the percentage amount that owner-occupied dwelling is paying in property taxes. Everything has increased over time. Ag has increased pretty slowly, and so you might think that this could get sort of off-shifted to, say, something like agriculture, which hasn't been paying as much as maybe owner-occupied dwelling. But it's important to keep in mind that there is no more new agriculture land being created. What is happening is some of that ag land has been turned into owner-occupied, so that might color the discussion a little bit. Now, from there, one of the things that the big problem that lawmakers have to really deal with is the fact that if you take from one of those classifications, it has to be sent somewhere else because the need is still there. And so when we talk about the property tax discussion, the other thing that also has to be kind of brought up and discussed is the education funding formula, and going back to what was done with the Blue Ribbon Task Force in 2016, which is basically that the state sets the rate, the valuation increase that then counties and school districts can assess locally.
So are there plans on the table to address this? I know Representative Venhuizen, before he was named lieutenant governor, was bringing a proposal. He brought it early this year. Now he has said he has to shift any bills that he has to another prime sponsor. Are there, tell me a little bit about what he was asking for and whether that has traction going forward now that he's lieutenant governor.
So basically, the bulk of the argument that now Lieutenant Governor Venhuizen was making is that if you want to bring meaningful property tax relief, you basically have to find $250 million somewhere. And part of his proposal was taking the current sales tax rate is 4.2% and bumping it up to 0.5%, and taking the money from taking that 0.8% and putting that towards property tax relief. And so that's certainly like one discussion that is being had. My last sort of rough count was that there are about 10 bills related to property tax relief. I think we're still waiting to see all of the bills that might be coming in. Another thing to note is that the governor's office, Governor Larry Roden, has convened a working group of state lawmakers. They met for the first time on Monday evening. They plan to meet again later this week and start meeting regularly throughout the rest of session, which runs through March 14th, to kind of come up with, to kind of look at those proposals, possibly come up with their own proposal, and really try to figure out a way to get everyone on board with how to address this topic, this issue.
Who are the players in that room? Are we talking legislative leadership, or are we talking other lawmakers?
I've not seen an official roster of who is on that list, but I would assume it's. I did speak with Republican State Senator Randy Dybert, who's a lawmaker from Lawrence County, lives in Spearfish and deals with like Lead and Deadwood, and so that's like a very interesting district when we're looking at the property tax issue because the valuations there are so much higher than a lot of other places in the state. So he's an example of somebody who is on that particular working group. I just don't know the full number and who all's on it.
Are short-term rentals part of this conversation?
I also don't know, but I would imagine that something like that would possibly be zoned commercial, and I'm only guessing on that because of sort of situations on the block that a block that I walk past on my way to work.
All right, we'll get more information about that in the days ahead to clarify. But to that point, this is really complicated, and it's hard to pull out the nuances of it. When will we start to see some kind of solidification? Will the governor, once we get through that, more information from that working group, do you think? How do you anticipate the story developing in the coming days and weeks?
I think we'll start seeing bill hearings on a number of proposals that are out there currently, starting probably next week. Time is of the essence because, again, when we're talking property tax reform and the education funding formula, these are really large and big issues, and they're only meeting until March 14th, right? And they have hundreds of other bills to consider and work on. I do think this is a priority for the legislature, but there's a lot going on and a lot of different things that everybody's trying to work on. Yeah. So in addition to maybe finding a legislative solution this year, there's also a proposal out there to set up another interim study to kind of look at owner-occupied dwelling property taxes. And again, this is kind of something that they're really taking serious because there is some potential ballot question language out there that would basically bring property taxes back to the levels that they were in like November of 2020 and only allow for like a very incremental increase after that. And that would really, really affect budgets for schools, budgets for counties, budgets for townships, and that sort of thing.
All right, SDPB's Lee Strubinger, thanks so much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Lori.
Our Dakota Political Junkies are after the break. You're in the moment on SDPB.
On the next Fresh Air, one of Pete Hegseth's first actions as Defense Secretary was to declare the end of the DEI era. A serious problem the military is facing, though, is a severe shortage of recruits. We'll talk about why, how the military is attempting to reverse the trend, and how vulnerable to attack we've become. With Dexter Filkins of The New Yorker. Join us.
Listen Wednesday afternoon at 2 Central, 1 Mountain on SDPB. Jordan Taylor is an ambitious chef from Sioux Falls with an unconventional story. Chasing Tables takes you through his journey, from interesting ways of getting noticed to finding good in toxic surroundings. We meet the people that mentor him and know him best. See how creativity and devotion make this chef an innovator within his community. Chasing Tables, Thursday at 8, 7 Mountain on SDPB TV.
Follow SDPB on Facebook. Watch Dakota Life Stories, learn about historical events, see pictures, and then share your favorites. Type SDPB in the Facebook search bar, and when the page opens, click the like button. Get social with SDPB on Facebook.
Politics and Public Policy reporting is supported by the Center for Western Studies at Augustana University.
Welcome back to In the Moment State House. I'm Lori Walsh. Federal employees across the nation are facing uncertainty during the first 100 days of President Donald Trump's administration as Trump seeks to refashion the federal government. Financial markets reeled on Monday, then restabilized as the president laid out his plans for international trade. Today, our Dakota Political Junkies are joining us with analysis. We have Lisa Hager, Associate Professor of Political Science at South Dakota State University, and David Wiltsey, Professor of Political Science at SDSU. We are all gathered, connected from various places via Zoom. And Dr. Hager, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Wiltsey, welcome as well.
Good to be here.
The headlines come very quickly here, and a lot of federal employees that's difficult for. They're getting social media messages in the morning and then memos in the evening with potential changes. Some have been sent home, some have been locked out of their office. David Wiltsey, let's start with you. This was part of Donald Trump's campaign promise to shake up federal government. It was expected. However, it is also causing a certain amount of expected chaos. Is that the point?
Apparently. And, in the private sector, there are people who kind of thrive on chaos. I think chaos can be a constructive and productive atmosphere in which innovation can kind of matriculate up. But unfortunately, in government, that usually is not the case. I mean, we really look for stability in government, continuity in policy, and in personnel. And this is what happens when you start throwing hand grenades around.
Yeah.
You just have, just kind of a seizure, atrophy in within the bureaucracy, and people have no idea how to react. We don't know if these things are legal. We don't know if they're going to hold in court. All sorts of actions that are being taken here. It's just so filled with uncertainty, and it's kind of what we expected, right? It's kind of what we voted for.
Well, 48% of the country did not vote for this, so it's not a 100% mandate by any means, which is, of course, causing some consternation across the nation as
No
well.
mandate at all,
Yeah.
but that's how elections work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Hager, help us understand what the bureaucracy is and is for. Why is it supposed to be stable and somewhat slow-moving?
Right. So our bureaucracy is there to implement legislation and policies. And so in order to do that effectively, they need to put regulations in place to really tell us how things are going to be working at any given point in time. And so it's also to create some stability, which obviously right now we have quite a bit of instability with what's going on, and that can be very disruptive. And at really any given time you turn on the news or you open social media, depending on what you're following, I suppose, or what you're watching, if you're looking at anything relating to government, you are going to see how there's a lot of instability occurring, and there's a lot of questions. And like you were bringing up, there's a lot of people who feel as if they did not vote for this. And so they have questions about what will happen moving forward to a variety of different agencies and departments.
Yeah. Let's talk about trust and a bureaucracy that's self-sustaining in some ways. It keeps itself functioning by not responding to the political whims of a new administration, although the current president is really trying to shake that up. We don't want Professor Wiltsey to question a report, for example, from the U.S. Surgeon General or from Department of Health and Human Services. We want to trust that that has a certain stability and is not influenced by the political tides. Does a shakeup like this risk throwing more of our institutions into the category of we don't know who to believe anymore?
Right. And, we are at a point where our trust in institutions has just been eroded and eroded over the last 15, 20 years to a point where people they don't know who to trust. Some of this is very deliberate, particularly, like you said, with statistics and other information that we rely upon from the government. To the degree that people just don't trust the statistics coming out on the economy, say, from the Biden administration or any number of things. In the good old days, this was something that we could really rely upon. It was kind of an accepted truth that people could operate upon because we knew that there was a clear separation between the political demands and the political needs of the administration and the professionals in the bureaucracy who are out there gathering that information and implementing policy. And what we're seeing is, a real desire on Trump's part to return to a politicized bureaucracy, to a patronage system, to one where he is putting himself in a position where he's kind of the nexus between government and the private sector. And that is really disturbing for a lot of folks, and it's inherently destabilizing, especially when it comes to our relationships with other countries
What's a
and our trade policies.
What's patronage system? What is that? Help us understand that, what that means.
Well, the patronage system was basically a fusion between the bureaucracy and the political party, where you had a very responsive bureaucracy that was out there to implement party policy and party needs within government. And in many respects, it was kind of a play to pay or pay to play environment where you would get favor by giving favor to politicians, and politicians would reward those who supported them along the way.
Professor Hager, Elon Musk is a private citizen, not elected, but yet given a certain amount of power right now. What are we seeing in these early weeks about just how much power and access he has?
I think we're seeing that he has quite a bit of access and influence given what the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, is attempting to accomplish and actually being able to accomplish. So even, recently we're seeing questions about what types of things should be funded and funding getting taken away based on what the Department of Government Efficiency is identifying. And then you see a lot of folks, reaching out to members of Congress, really trying to get some sort of answer with respect to, what can really be done about what Musk and others are doing. And that's really the difficult thing with the fact that, that's not a position where we have, presidential appointment and Senate confirmation. And so there's not really a lot just right off the top that Congress can necessarily do to try to curb what's initially going on.
Lisa, if Congress has appropriated money, can the president can he just stop that? It's been appropriated.
Mm-hmm.
Can he put the brakes on something?
So,
How does Congress, what is the administrative process for Congress to say, no, that money was appropriated and we wanted it to go to this foreign aid, for example?
mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's definitely been instances where we've seen presidents try to circumvent those processes in the past. So basically gets into impoundment politics. And so, that's rather complicated. But I think, realistically speaking, what we're going to see is that, like getting litigated in the courts, because this is going to be an issue between what's going on with those two branches and essentially a question of implementation at that point. And, it's sometimes a little bit dicey to see where the courts will come in on this. They have a way of getting out of the political thicket by calling this a political question, excuse me, and really making it an issue between Congress and the president and saying they should ultimately work it out. So, sometimes we don't really actually get a real resolution like we'd like to see.
Yeah.
And that's the big fear in this particular situation, is that the Supreme Court will just kick it to the side, call it a political question, and it will it'll be up to the administration really in the end. And that's our fear, that this court just is not going to be any kind of effective constitutional or legal break, even though in many instances they're probably violating the law, the letter and intent of the law on this, particularly with impoundment. And this nonsense that's going on with USAID right now, just very damaging to our relationships around the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when courts do call it a political question, they're basically allowing the status quo to be what's the answer in the situation. So it would side with the Trump administration.
Right. All right. Meanwhile, we have, and before, during the campaign, I asked, many U.S. Senator Mike Rounds, for example, and Congressman Dusty Johnson, I would ask them about specific policies that they were hearing in the Trump campaign. And again, I heard, well, don't just pay attention to what he says, look at what he does. You campaign in poetry, but you govern in prose, I think was what Congressman Johnson said, with the idea of he's a negotiator. He's going to start out with something big, and then it's going to settle into something that's more reasonable. With tariffs, Professor Wiltse, we saw this declaration that these tariffs would be implemented. The markets go down substantially and quickly, and then all of a sudden, there's a 30-day pause. Is this a negotiation? And once again, business, private sector negotiation, statesmanship. Where are the intersections and where do those things sort of diverge? There's a lot that I just said there, but pull something out that you think is really relevant for our conversation today, if you would, please.
Yeah. If it's negotiation, it's terrible negotiation, not only in just tactic, but what we're getting out of it. I mean, look at what has changed between last week and this week in terms of our relationship with Canada. There's not been one iota of a change in terms of policy. The big difference is now we're getting, the national anthem's getting booed at Canadian hockey games. It is just fundamentally damaging to one of our closest, most important allies and trading partners. And it's all for this performance that Trump loves to play. He'll create an issue, in this case, pumps up this issue with fentanyl and illegal immigration, even though, hardly any fentanyl is coming over the border. The problem with immigration is not people coming from Canada into the United States. Makes that the center of a crisis, goes, does his little bluster online, does his performance, and then in the end says, well, I got this concession from them. They're going to be doing X, Y, and Z. In this case, the fentanyl czar or something like that. And in the end, we get nothing. Nothing has changed other than it's just stressing the relationship, and it's all for a performance. It's kind of his, it's kind of his MO. And I think one of the reasons the markets didn't go absolutely bonkers either on Friday or on Monday is because most players are figuring out that this is just what he does. And in the end, the damage is not going to be nearly as catastrophic had those tariffs actually gone into place. And hopefully people in industry and in Congress have been in his ear, saying, look, here's what's at stake. This would be catastrophic.
Well, we will leave it there for today, but we have much more to talk about in the future. Dr. Dave Wiltse and Dr. Lisa Hager, both political scientists from South Dakota State University in Brookings. I thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Having us.
We have more Dakota Political Junkies coming up next. Gene Hunhoff and Linda Duba are with us. We will turn the lens toward Pierre. You're in the Moment State House on SDPB.
What exactly is an executive order? It's a question we received from so many of you. Like others before him, Donald Trump has signed dozens. But why do presidents have this power in the first place? Our listener-led series looks at the history of executive orders, their role, and how well they work. That's next time on 1A.
Listen Wednesday morning at 10 Central, 9 Mountain on SDPB.
Support for SDPB comes from SDN Communications. If network scalability and consolidating vendors sound like music to your ears, you can keep all of your network solutions together with SDN Communications. Enjoy the uptime.
Hello, it's Michelle Martin. At Morning Edition, we bring you the news of the day, but also conversations about art.
The piano was where I left all of my words and all of my stories and all of my pain.
Scientific findings.
In total, I think we looked at over 500 specimens. That's a lot of poop.
And stories that make you smile. Start your weekdays informed and inspired with Morning Edition from NPR News.
From 5 to 9 Central, 4 to 8 Mountain on SDPB.
Program funding by Northern State University School of Fine Arts. Art inspires, comforts, and connects us. At NSU, students refine their artistic passions and become leaders in their field. More about visual and performing arts degrees at northern.edu.
Welcome back to In the Moment State House. I'm Lori Walsh. As state lawmakers submit their bills this session, they face a challenging revenue outlook. We're connecting with two former state lawmakers with long-standing service on the Joint Appropriations Committee. Linda Duba is a former Democratic representative in the South Dakota House, and she joined me in SDPB's Kirby Family Studio here in Sioux Falls. And Jean Hunhoff is a former Republican senator in the state legislature. She joined our conversation via Zoom. Senator Jean Hunhoff, welcome back. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for the invite. Always a pleasure.
And Representative Linda Duba here in the SDPB Kirby Family Studio with me. Welcome back as well.
Thank you. Happy to join both of you.
All right. I want to do a little update on Appropriations Committee, particularly because the new Lieutenant Governor is Tony Venhuizen, who was on the Appropriations Committee, will have to be replaced. How big of a deal is it to lose that experience on that committee? Senator Hunhoff, we'll start with you, and really bring somebody new in at this point in session.
Well, I think it'll be a challenge. They've got, certainly the majority are new members, and you bring someone else who maybe hasn't been following the process, they're going to have to get up to speed. And, in the departmental agencies they've been reviewing, there's a lot of information that has been out there. And so they will be at a disadvantage. Now, it depends, again, where they're going to be coming in and, who they're going to be aligning with. It'll be in the House, but certainly, there's some different opinions that are out there. So it'll depend on where that individual, I think, is coming from. And again, don't know if there's some applicants out there that might have served in the legislature before and maybe have been on appropriations, again, how that decision will be made. But for right now, if you bring someone who has had no experience, it will be a challenge for that individual, and the importance will be where they line up with the rest of the committee in that House.
Yeah. Linda Duba, what would you add to that?
I don't know that I could say much more. I've heard some people that have applied for that District 13 position, and I know one of them is a very seasoned appropriations person. I was a little surprised to hear that name. So we'll see how that goes down. Who do they replace Tony with in the House in general? And is that an individual who does have experience in appropriations and could slide right in? Or is it someone else? Because I've also heard other names coming from the House. So don't know.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Just the interjection, that's not to say that they'll be appointed to appropriations either. I mean, I think it depends who gets in there. And then, he's on that committee, but it goes back to the, Speaker of the House to make that decision where that person goes on committees. And I guess from past experience, when we have people come in, there's been some switching that has gone on. So, I don't know if it's an automatic to say, well, yep, that person will go to appropriations. I think in fairness may or may not occur.
Very true.
So the advantages or not of Representative Venhuizen becoming Lieutenant Governor in this difficult budget year, and then also bringing with him the experience and the knowledge that he had going in. Intersect that with the fact that we know Governor Roden said in his first address to the session that he was not going to reintroduce a new budget, that he would be working with Governor Kristi Noem's proposed budget. He was aware that there were many programs that were popular that he wanted to work to restore, but it was going to be a very challenging revenue year. So that was what we kind of heard out of the gate from him from a revenue message. We know Lieutenant Governor Tony Venhuizen has this experience, but what's his role? Is it separated from appropriations at this point? Are there, Linda, what do you see happening next with this particular configuration, which is really brand new?
Well, I would say that Lieutenant Governor Venhuizen will keep a very close eye on appropriations for Governor Roden's office, for the executive branch, and he will probably be whispering in the ear of, both the chairs. And, Jean, do you think I'm wrong there?
No, I don't think you are. I also think he has again, as an appropriator, and you and I worked both with him, and,
Yes.
As co-chair, he certainly has some policies regarding appropriations that, he has brought out in the past, and I think you're absolutely right. He's, bringing that perspective, which is a very positive for the governor because with his knowledge base. But I guess the question out there is everything that he has been on page with will be on page with the governor.
Right.
Sure. Anything else before we pivot to a few things that have been interesting this past week, especially the education savings account debate? But before we pivot to that, Jean, do you see anything else in the Appropriations Committee that's been coming out of there that you think is really worth noting right now?
Well, I'm just going to give some observations. I think my first one, and I haven't listened to all the committee meetings and I have not listened to the work groups, but in what I've been listening, what really has surprised me is that because we have so many new members, it's the questions that are being asked by the committee members. They are all very good questions, but for a new legislator to walk into appropriations, I'm not hearing questions being asked that I thought from all my years that I've been in there whenever we've got new members. So that makes me think that, number one, either joint chairs did a great job in orientating the new members, or there's more discussion going on outside the committee by the individual caucuses as to, where that budget is going. And I think the other thing that I'm sort of a little surprised, not in the sense that, they're certainly looking at not necessarily the revenues other for property tax replacement, I've heard some of that, but decreasing, programming. And in listening to some of the departments that have come to present, even, asking some, I guess, way high questions, not really understanding what the implications are if you're going to take away those dollars. I mean, what the impact. Certainly the groups that are affected are presenting either their opposition to reductions and why we need, but there's not a lot of vetting out or ferreting as to what's really the implication and do you understand where those dollars that are not coming and what's the unintended consequences that are going to come out. So, the flavor there is very broad-based, not real concise yet, which is typical, but for a new group, I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
I think there's also, and Senator Hunhoff, you and I discussed this, this new one-stop center in Sioux Falls. There's a work group assigned to that whole piece that's happening, and we're going to be moving all of the departments that are certainly in the Sears building, and then others into this building, and the rents are 3 and 4 times more. And there's a 30-year lease that's been signed with that building. So I know the work group is taking a look at that to find out, do they have any wiggle room? Does this need to happen? Can we renegotiate that lease? These rents are extremely high. And in a tough budget year, to have your rent triple or even quadruple, that is putting a lot of stress. And again, taking away, as Senator Hunhoff said, from programming that's essential to the state of South Dakota and to its people.
And one of the challenges is I feel very good about the reach of this program, but there are a lot of people who are going to have no idea that anything is happening in Pierre until a program disappears.
That's
and
right.
then they'll want to know what happened in Pierre. It's hard to reach all the constituents. Do you get calls throughout the legislative? I guess what I'm wondering is, are lawmakers trying to connect with their constituents in specific ways to find out some of that impact, Senator Hunhoff, or is that something that just comes up in the committee when the departments are there in front of them? Or are you calling back home somehow, or are you crowdsourcing questions, from voters? How do you stay connected with the people who put you in office?
Again, I can't speak for this group that's there. We had one Cracker Barrel here, and I listened to it, and it's sort of a formatted, so there wasn't really that opportunity for the, I guess, participants to ask direct questions. They're formatted and just answers. But for my previous history, when there was, a subject out there that was impacted, I contacted, and those groups would also contact. And I think, again, when you're looking at social programming, those are people services. And if you don't understand what those people services are and what they directly do and what the outcomes are, it's very easy to bypass that. So I don't know if these people are reaching out. I'm sure in listening to the opponent testimony on some of that funding, certainly was definitive and they presented, but I don't know the style of this new group, what it is that they, go out to seek more, because you're covering a lot of information, and to get that additional information takes time. So again, I can only say what I did, but I don't know what these new people are doing. I don't see in our community anything publicly other than the two. There's another Cracker Barrel next weekend in a small community, but it appears most of the discussion that I'm hearing on are more on the policy issues than I'm hearing in the community about funding, other than those that are direct providers of care.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about education savings accounts, because this was a big push from Governor Kristi Noem. Governor Larry Roden in his speech also said that he was very interested in pursuing ideas about school choice. But some of the early bills have failed and not come out of a committee. But the debate is far from over, and certainly the homeschooling community, the micro schools, the parochial schools, they're all interested in this idea of vouchers or education savings accounts. Representative Duba, I heard Secretary of Education Graves say that there are education deserts in South Dakota when he was speaking in support of a House Bill 1020, I think it was. And that surprised me to hear the Secretary of Education say there are education deserts in the public school thing and that he would want to support an alternative to public schools. I would have thought though that would be his responsibility to address the schools that he considered were struggling.
Yes. His testimony, I will say it was very disappointing when he made that statement, coupled with the fact that he said it's time for our public schools to have competition. So let's do one thing. Let's say this now. School choice has always been there. You have the choice to homeschool your child, send them to a micro school, send them to a private school, just not on the state's budget. So let's be clear on that. So you have school choice today. But the more important thing is the Department of Education secretary should be looking for ways to improve the public education and not be bringing in an outside competitor to say, competition is good. So this is demoralizing to parents, to teachers, to administrators, and to staff. We're already seeing a crunch in what we're doing, and we heard testimony from several individuals that are serving on school boards as to how this 1.25% increase is going to impact them. And they're not going to be able to, as their costs increase, they know, based on the law we passed last year, that they still have to maintain a certain level of teacher pay, but that doesn't cover all of the other costs for staffing and supplies and the things that we need. Public education also, I'm going to say this, we just gave them $6 million for the science of reading. And now we've brokered it such that starting this year, in the next fiscal year 26, we will no longer need to pay an outside vendor for that program. The Board of Regents has worked out a curriculum with the Department of Education that our teachers can take advantage of to help teachers even more accelerate their knowledge of improving learning techniques for students. That's what we should be focusing on instead of hearing about education deserts. Oh, you got an education desert? Let's go get a private school or a micro school. That makes no sense. Let's go figure out how we lift up our educators and our programs. Thank you.
Senator Hunhoff, what did you hear in the education savings account debate that stood out to you as something that would be relevant for listeners today?
I think you just mentioned these deserts. Where is this? We've never heard about this before. Again, I will refer to what Representative Duba said. Choice has always been there. We have the insurance tax that is going to support that outside group that is really a community group that is, allocating resources, and we always hear about in any of the cuts that are being made, we'll go back to the community. Well, the insurance, we gave them that opportunity and they took that. So, we have done some funding, and I agree with, Representative Duba. We've got to focus on K through 12, and if a person wants that other opportunity, they can do it. It's going to be a battle, and I do believe it's going to come back in some form, as you have alluded to. There's all kinds of options to bring a similar bill, smoke it out, or do anything like that. There seems to be a momentum, and I think, again, the data that they're using out there, again, we don't know where those deserts are. Secondly, there was allusion to the scores going down, and they're, blaming that on COVID and still some, and I don't think that's the answer either. I mean, I don't think we have accurate data to reflect what these individuals are doing. Plus, again, the other thing is they don't fall under the purview of the Department of Education. They get the money to do within the criteria that's established, but we don't sit on their school boards. We don't sit, when I say we, I mean the community. None of that taxpayer, other than those that are sending their kids to that school or that micro school or doing the homeschooling, and there's no data or equity in, are their standards the same? Do they need to be the same? Do they need to be different? Those are things that, I think we need to get clarification on, especially if you're going to go that direction, so that if that individual chooses a different option than the public school system, they need to be meeting the same standards. They need to have this, expected outcomes, and they need to have transparency if we're putting those dollars in there.
Yeah. Well, let's also talk about the fact that there was a survey recently done, and 58% of the public, 20 points higher than those who were in favor of doing this, 38% said, hey, yeah, this is a good idea. 58% of South Dakotans surveyed said, no, we need to improve our current public education system and lift up our teachers and our administrators. So what does that tell us? We're pushing something in the legislature that isn't popular with the public. And to your point, Senator Hunhoff, where are their standards? Remember, these people can accept who they want. Public schools support everyone. This is not an apples to apples compare, and we have no data. We've asked for it multiple times. We asked for it for the, the pie money that Senator Hunhoff, and they can't produce it. They can't show us where people are performing better.
As you look at the first few days of Governor Larry Roden's term, his speech to the joint session, and some of the things he's coming out of the gate with, are there impressions that you have about his leadership going forward? We'll start with you, Senator Hunhoff. Did you hear things that you thought, okay, this is a change, this is in fact a reset? We know he's very politically aligned with Governor Kristi Noem, but maybe he has a very distinctly different leadership style. What would you pull out?
I think the one that he has really emphasized is engaging with the people of South Dakota. He said his communication is going to be better. And I think the other side of it, I served with the governor for 24 years. We started together in the legislature, so I've been around him a long time. He has that ability with the humor to infuse that, and he's also been someone to sit down at the table and try to work out solutions. I think, like I said, here's what I see in the sense. He has been lieutenant governor, so he's been in the eyes, but he hasn't been out there. Now he's got 2 years to demonstrate what his agenda is and to reignite that office, because I think, the priorities of our former governor sort of shifted this past year. And so I think he's trying to say, wait a minute, I'm going to be back here. I'm going to be out and about, and I'm going to talk to people. I'm going to listen. I'm going to sit down. And to me, that's a different kind of style than we had. And that's not a negative or a positive. That's just his style. And I think that's where the proof of the pudding. And he's going to be challenged this session because, you've already alluded to the fact that he's carrying what the Governor Noem has proposed. And just in this last conversation about funding for choices, he's going to have to deal with that. And I think also in his commentary, he talked about the people that have surrounded him, that he's brought in his executive staff to support him, to help him in finding the right solutions that are out there. And I think the other thing that is interesting is that I believe it was announced that the lieutenant governor is going to be full-time. And so that's another change. So does that add strength then in those two individuals working together now on a daily basis rather than just during session? And are, those two heads together going to bring out better solutions for what we're trying to deal with?
Representative Duba, what would you say about Governor Roden?
The thing that I heard him also say is he talked about civility, and he wants to bring civility back. Things have been somewhat adversarial from time to time in Pierre between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and even within the legislative branch, as we know. So I think it's important that he is pushing the fact that we need to be respectful of one another. And as Senator Hunhoff said, he's going to be a listener, and he's going to be in South Dakota, focused on South Dakotans. I also heard him say he invited in KELOLAND TV on his first day, and he gave a press conference, and then he said, I had an opportunity to go to the prison, first time I'd ever been there. Yeah. So he's already starting to take charge in the areas that are really hot spots, the prison being one, and he's pushing for a new facility, which makes my heart happy because we need to improve those conditions, both for the employees and for the inmates. So he's really focused on South Dakota's needs and the people of the state.
Yeah, I was able to sit down with Lieutenant Governor Van Huysen an hour after the announcement, and we're still working on the schedule for an interview with the governor and lieutenant governor together, but that's all coming together as schedules merge. So definitely a change from the press standpoint as far as access going forward. What else is on your mind as we wrap up? Any final topics you want to hit or talk about, Senator Hunhoff?
Well, I think it's going to get more interesting, is what I'm going to say, because with these policy issues are continuing to bubble, come out of committee, get to the floor, and you're seeing some changes among legislators that were here last year and now that are this year, and how they're voting on some of these policy issues. And I think there's a ramping up for the next election in South Dakota as to who's going to be in that leadership. And I think everyone's going to be trying to identify who's who out there, and that's all going to be part of this next session.
Representative Duba?
I agree, 100%. We're going to see some really interesting bills come through committee right now. Things that it's a tough time right now in South Dakota. We've got a tough revenue stance in a budget year. We've got people concerned about their property tax, about costs in general, and yet we continue to see these bills that are what I like to refer to as one-off culture wars that really are just marginalized tiny little groups of people, or really promote or push an agenda that just isn't top of mind for most people at the kitchen table. So you're right, Senator Hunhoff. People are already positioning themselves for the next election when, your job should be nose to the grindstone. Let's go figure out how we make this budget work and how we do the best we can for the people of South Dakota. I would encourage legislators to get familiar what's happening in that appropriations room, even though they're not in there. Talk to those appropriators and really start to focus on programming.
That's Representative Linda Duba and Senator Jean Hunhoff. And that is our show for today. We hope that it served you. You can find all the In the Moment State House programs on our YouTube channel, and you can always find our Dakota Political Junkies conversation on your favorite podcast platform. From all of us here at SDPB, I'm Lori Walsh. Thanks for watching.
Irish poet Padra Gotuma spends a lot of time thinking about other people's poetry. In a new anthology, he brings us 44 poems about the pleasure and pain of relationships.
I was curious about how it is that poetry could speak to all kinds of experiences of the human condition.
I'm Mary Louise Kelly, poet Padra Gotuma, on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Listen this afternoon, beginning at 3 Central, 2 Mountain on SDPB.
This evening on Jazz Nightly, we'll hear the latest by guitarist Dave Stryker. He has an album of film music with strings. Also, San Francisco trumpeter and composer Eric Jacobson mixes jazz with minimalism, and the Hot Toddies recreate the classic sounds of swing. I'm Carl Gerke, and you can join me at 8 Central, 7 Mountain, here on SDPB Radio.
This is South Dakota Public Broadcasting.